all been following the college admissions bribery scandal? Okay, so I have been tracking Hurricane Dorian much more closely than I have this story. But every so often I run across another facet of the bribery scandal that makes me stop and just have to say, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? Now, if you have not been following it, here's a quick 3-hour backstory. Okay, last spring, federal prosecutors charged upwards of 50 people with criminal conspiracy to influence undergraduate admission decisions at several top American universities. Now, the investigation was nicknamed Operation Varsity Blues, named after, I think, an old Tom Cruise movie. And in it were caught up in this net several actors. Most notably was Lori Loughlin. Now, Lori Loughlin, if you do not know her, she's known as Aunt Becky to her Full House fans. Aunt Becky? Aunt Becky? Sweet, wholesome, all-American Aunt Becky? What was she thinking? Now, Aunt Becky has pled not guilty, and she's about to go on trial, and she's beginning to have some second thoughts about that particular strategy. But there was another actress who was caught in the scam, one who did plead guilty, and that was Felicity Huffman of Desperate Housewives. And apparently, she was a desperate mother who would do anything to get her child into a named school. And again, I have to ask, what was she thinking? In fact, her daughter was so embarrassed by this when this came out. The daughter who was caught up coincidentally in the scandal, and she wrote her mother and said, "Why didn't you trust me? Why didn't you think I could do this on my own?" Well, Huffman's about to be sentenced. And the U.S. Attorney's Office in charge of the prosecution apparently answered the question, what was she thinking, when they said that Felicity Huffman should spend at least, and get this, 1 month in jail. Okay, that's not what got my attention, it was this. She should spend at least 1 month in jail because her efforts weren't driven by need or desperation, but by a sense of entitlement, or at least moral cluelessness, facilitated by wealth and insularity. Moral cluelessness. Now that was the phrase that jumped off my screen, because that can describe so many actions today, and not just by the rich and famous. Moral cluelessness can happen anytime we confuse wants with needs, especially when my wants run roughshod over your needs. You want your child to go to the very best school. Who doesn't? But does that mean you turn a want into a need to do anything and everything, including breaking the law to make sure that happens? Now, it's very easy to point a finger in the college admissions scandal, but doesn't moral cluelessness happen in other areas? Moral cluelessness is the most charitable phrase I can come up with to describe government repudiation of climate change, reduction of environmental standards, trade wars that are hurting farmers, trade wars that are hurting you and me. The sentence here for such cluelessness is not a month in jail, but it's a suffering planet, and trying to answer the questions from the next generation who will want to know why we did not stand up to defend this fragile earth, our island home. Even here, though, it's easy to point fingers. And I think one of the reasons why I found this phrase striking is that I wondered, is this something that could happen to the rest of us, to all of us? Could we be so unaware of the needs of others that we too could run roughshod over people to get what we want? Or is it okay if we do that for others? Is it okay if we do it for our children? Well, in AA, asking such questions is called doing a moral inventory. Doing a moral inventory. It's the fourth of the 12 steps where you're asked to make a searching and fearless moral inventory. But you don't have to be in AA to do that. You can do that for yourselves in just a couple of minutes in the confession. When we look at all the ways that we have missed the mark and not lived fully as the person who has been fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God. And every time we do that, God takes us into God's hands and reforms us. Just like you heard us singing, molds us, fashions us back into the person we were meant to be, pressing out anything that resembles moral carelessness. And as we just heard from the prophet Jeremiah, God is offering God's people yet another chance to turn from their self-destructive ways and to try again. And as happens so often in the Hebrew Bible, God gives a visual to make sure we get the point. God tells Jeremiah, go down to the potter's shed. Watch the potter work the clay. Look at that lump of clay that is about to be made into something useful. Maybe it's a bowl to hold food. Maybe it's a cup to hold water. Maybe it's going to be a piece of art. And if the clay works against the potter's touch, the potter can always rework it. Have you ever watched a potter at work? Have you ever tried it yourself? I have. It wasn't pretty. But this was a visual illustration that Jeremiah needed to share with the people of Israel. You see, at this time, they turned their back on all that God had done for them, and they had chased after foreign deities. Gods who weren't God, but made from clay or wood or metal. Gods made by human hand rather than humans made by the hand of God. Gods who had no power except for the power to entice Israel to be like everybody else. Gods who encouraged moral carelessness. And the price Israel was about to pay for wanting to be like everybody else was to be absorbed by these surrounding kingdoms and cultures like everyone else, this time by force, as the Babylonians were about to overrun Israel. And the physical bondage they were about to experience was preceded by the spiritual bondage to the gods who weren't really gods. In wanting to be like everyone else and wanting to be better than everyone else, they'd forgotten their basic need for the Holy One who made them, called them, and set them apart to have a special relationship with the divine. Now, if you don't read the Bible with care, it's very easy, especially when you read the Hebrew Bible, to think that there's a God of wrath who wants to punish for every little thing. But that's lazy reading. Even worse, it's lazy thinking. Because if you really dig in, what you will find is the God who wants to save. The God who wants to save. But the God who wants to save will not run roughshod over free will. And if our free will is to turn to all these lesser gods made by hand, well, then God will allow that too. Even if it breaks the heart of God. Even if it breaks our own hearts and our own lives. And again, the best illustration I know for this is AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. If you've ever been to an AA meeting, you'll see church at its finest and in its rawest form. I have been to such meetings, first as a seminarian to learn something of this experience, later as a priest to support those who had taken the first steps of recovery. I am in awe of those meetings, absolutely in awe. You see, people in recovery don't make excuses for their moral cluelessness. They realize their addiction is not just physical, it's spiritual. It has a spiritual underpinning, which is why the first step of recovery is this admission. We were powerless over alcohol, and that our lives had become unmanageable. Step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Step 3. We made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. And then there's that fourth step, the fearless moral inventory. The list goes on. I really encourage you to Google AA and read for yourselves their 12 steps. Not as interpreted by anyone else, but their 12 steps. People in AA are those who have allowed themselves to be molded by the true hands of the potter and been remade. They have been reborn. The most spiritual, vivid people I know frequently are those who have come on the other side of AA. I wouldn't wish that journey on anybody, but the fruit of it is amazing. They've been reborn. And that's what I want for myself, and that's what I want for you. Every day to be reborn. To be reborn by Jesus into the person we were always meant to be. Fearfully, wonderfully, and beautifully made. Do you know how beautiful you are? Do you know how wonderful you are? Do you know that you were created by God as a beautiful, wonderful human being? You were created to be unmarred by moral carelessness, but to be marked by the hand of God. Now, someone who loves history, as someone who got a degree that was so useful in anthropology, actually it was. From time to time I come across pottery shards. You know what those are? You know, the broken pieces of pottery. And I have a collection of those, and every so often you can find the thumbprint of the potter in those shards. You see the thumbprint of the potter. That's what I want people to see in us, the thumbprint of the potter. But y'all, it does not end there. If it just ends there, it makes us narcissists, and that's not what God is calling us to be. So it doesn't end there. It cannot end there. We are not just marked as Christ's own forever, which is part of our baptismal creed. We are marked as Christ's own forever for the sake of the world. We are marked as Christ's own forever to change the world. I have had the rich blessing recently to break bread with some of our new members, especially young adults. And that's what I've been hearing from them. A hunger to change the world. Not just to be marked by Christ, but to let that mark change the world for Christ. And y'all, I for one cannot wait to see what they will be doing. And I for one can't wait to see what you will be doing as one who has been marked as Christ's own forever. In Jesus' name. Amen.